Have you spent a significant amount of time living outside your passport country during your developmental years? Do you come from an expat, military, diplomat, missionary, or international business family background? If so, then this podcast is for you.
Welcome to the TCK Research Podcast, where we discuss the current state of research on third culture kids, cross-culture kids, expat families, and international life in general.
My name is Andrea Schmidt, and I've been an expat for over 30 years, having lived in a total of 9 countries. I'm a coach for TCK girls, and I'm currently completing my master's degree in psychology.
And I'm Mathieu Gagnon, an adult third culture kid who grew up in 6 countries until the age of 15. And I'm now a professor of psychology in Ontario, Canada.
Every episode, we bring you a fascinating conversation with a leading researcher in the field.
If you're listening on YouTube or another platform, please subscribe to our channel. And if you enjoyed this episode, please press the thumbs up or like button, share it on your social media platforms, or send it to a friend.
If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can reach us at tckresearchpod@gmail.com.
Let's jump right in.
Enjoy the podcast.
Our guest today is Dr.Jennie Germann Molz, professor of sociology at the College of the Holy Cross, Massachusetts. And we are discussing her 2017 paper entitled Learning to Feel Global, Exploring the Emotional Geographies of Worldschooling, published in the journal Emotion, Space, and Society.
So welcome to the podcast. Our guest today is Jennie Germann Molz. She's a professor of sociology at the College of the Holy Cross, and she's been there for 17 years, if I remember correctly, since 2007. It's in Worcester, Massachusetts, where Jennie teaches courses on social theory, travel and tourism, mobile technologies, global citizenship, and emotion. She received her PhD in sociology from Lancaster University in England, where she held a postdoctoral research fellowship in the Center for Mobilities Research. And Jennie's research interests include tourism mobilities and mobile technologies, also mobile families and educational travel, global citizenship, home and belonging. Jennie, you've conducted pioneering research on round-the-world backpackers, travel blogging, family volunteerism, family mobilities, and work schooling. And apart from all that, you've also published 3 books and been a co-editor of the journal Hospitality and Society. Welcome to the podcast. I hope I haven't forgotten anything, because your bio was quite long, I must admit.
Thank you for that warm introduction.
And the paper we'll be discussing today is Learning to Feel Global from 2017, Exploring the Emotional Geographies of Worldschooling.
It's such a cool title, Learning to Feel Global.
Right.
I really like that those two concepts come together.
Yeah.
But before we start talking about that paper, we always like to get a sense of where the guests are coming from, not like geographically where you're from, although that can be part of the story, but what your experience has been, or your personal relationship has been or is, to this whole kind of concept of global mobility, third culture individuals, third culture kids. So what is your personal TCK expat global mobility story? Tell us a little bit about that, if you can.
Sure, yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm really thrilled to be here. And I can tell you where I'm coming from, but only in the second sense of the word, because if you ask me where I'm from, I can't tell you. I had a very, very mobile childhood, all within the United States, but still quite busy with moving around a lot. I think I lived in 9 different houses, and I went to 11 different schools before I graduated from high school. And so people always ask me if my dad was in the military.
Mhm.
And I say, no, he was a Lutheran minister and then later became a marriage and family counselor. And so we were always moving for his different church postings, and then later for him to go back to school and then to take up this new career as a psychologist. So I have a deep affinity with TCKs, even though my mobility was all within the United States. I was born in Memphis. I lived in Lafayette, Louisiana, St. Louis, Missouri, New Orleans, Louisiana, Dallas, Texas. Like we just moved all over the place. And as soon as I graduated from high school, I left the country. I went to Italy and was a study abroad student for a year. Came back to the US and went to college at the University of Texas, and then spent a couple of years working in DC, but then quickly left the country again, went and traveled around the world, backpacked around the world for a few years, which is where my interest in round the world backpackers came from, that I researched in my
Mhm.
PhD. When I was getting I got a master's degree in popular culture studies in Bowling Green, Ohio. My husband got a job in Singapore. So as soon as I graduated with the master's degree, we moved to Singapore for a couple of years. And then when I decided to do the PhD, the program that really called to me was the sociology program at Lancaster in England. So we
Mhm.
lived in England for 6 years, where my son Elliot was born. And so that's when I became a TCK mom, I guess,
Mhm.
Mhm.
initially. And I guess all of that personal mobility from childhood on through my early adulthood just really sparked all these questions about, what does this mean for my identity? What does this mean for my sense of home? What does this mean for how I do or don't belong in different communities or even in my own country?
Mhm.
Right. And so I think in that sense, I think where a lot of my research questions are coming from are probably very similar to where a lot of the research questions posed toward TCKs are coming from.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a wonderful. I believe there's a term that I've heard. I don't know if you've heard it, Jenny and Andrea, but domestic TCK.
Mhm.
Oh,
So
okay,
Yeah.
maybe that's
domestic,
Yeah.
me.
right?
That's you. That would be
That
you. Yeah.
refers to
Yeah.
because there's this idea of, and there's this growing concern in well, in some kind of for some folks in the whole kind of who think about this, that you know, some countries are really big, and if you travel around and live in different states of America, or in different provinces of Canada,
Mhm.
you have much in common with people who grew up, in different countries or cultures. So I think the term is domestic
Yeah.
TCK, if I'm
Yeah.
not mistaken. Very interesting.
Helpful, yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Okay.
Okay. Should we let's move on to your paper.
Yes.
So in your paper, you introduce us to Carissa, who is a writer and a mother of two school-age children, and how she found herself educating her children abroad for a period of time in a manner that is called world schooling. And this world schooling concept is central in your study. What can you tell us about this? And
Hmm.
yep, go into as much detail as possible to make it easy to understand for all the listeners, please.
Okay. World schooling. So, world schooling has become a lot more popular recently, especially since COVID
Mm-hmm.
kind of made people aware that they could educate their kids remotely or online, and they could work remotely or online. And so I think this has become a much more popular lifestyle choice. But when I started studying the phenomenon about 10 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
world schooling wasn't really a common term yet. And in fact, a lot of the families I was interacting with weren't even using the term world schooling. They were calling themselves road schoolers or travel schoolers or families on the move, or they had, different terminology to kind of uh, anchor a community of these mobile families. But there were a few pioneers, I guess, in the sector. People like Lainey Liberty, Jennifer Sutherland Miller, and Eli Gerzon, who were really using the word world schooling and began to popularize it on their own blogs and in their own publications. And so I usually describe world schooling as, think of homeschooling, but instead of educating the kids at home, you're educating them while traveling all over the world. Um, and I also find Eli Gerzon's definition helpful. He was looking for a word that wasn't quite homeschooling, because he saw homeschooling as just replicating school at home. But he wanted to think of world schooling not as replicating school, but as doing something completely different and really using travel and using the world itself as the children's classroom. So instead of coming home with a bunch of worksheets that the kids have to fill out, whether they do that at home or, at the train station or something, he thought that world schooling really is more an orientation to the world as your teacher, so to speak, or to travel as your teacher. And so that is kind of the definition that I find to be most commonly held by the families that I speak to. Some of the world schooling families in my study didn't even really travel all that much, but they very much had this idea that experience engagement with the world is the key way that they wanted their kids to learn. And so that is the philosophy. And then the practice of world schooling can look really, really different from one family to another. So, like I said, some families, maybe they only travel on the weekends or for a few weeks a year. Other families go fully to the other side of the spectrum. They sell their homes, they leave their jobs, they pull the kids out of school, they winnow all of their material possessions down to a couple of backpacks, and they just travel constantly. And then everything in between. So it's kind of hard to really give you like a snapshot of a world schooling family, because there is so much diversity in the way people do it. But I think if you think first in terms of the philosophy that children are learning experientially from their engagement with the environment around them, and then practically that involves some form of travel.
It's a radically different way to conceive, because I was thinking of in education, we often hear about, well, it's important for learners to be actively engaged, and I mean it's the ultimate form of active learning in a sense, right? Because you're actively engaged within mobility. On top of that, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. Thank you for that. And this world schooling concept. You mentioned in the paper in your introduction, and this is, I mean, even the title talks about emotions, because the title has the word emotional geography in it. So you mentioned that this world schooling concept involves a continuous flow of complex and layered emotions, especially as children learn to become global citizens. And in a way, you seem to be interested in kind of understanding this process, to use a geographic analogy, mapping it or something like that, and you propose that this process, this emotional learning process of world schooling, can be understood with an approach that you call emotional geography, or sometimes you mention emotional geographies. What exactly is emotional geography, and why do you think it can be used to understand something about world schooling?
This is a concept I had used in my previous research as well, and I find it so fascinating and so helpful. I borrow the term emotional geography or emotional geographies because often it's multiple.
Right.
Um, from the British cultural geographers Joyce Davidson, Liz Bondy, and Mick Smith. And it's a concept for thinking about the relationship between physical places or physical landscapes or the environment and felt emotions.
Yeah.
So they see this very much as a relationship. So they say places become meaningful in relation to our feelings when we're in those places or our feelings about those places. But at the same time, places can evoke emotions in us. And so they're really interested in looking at that kind of back and forth relationship between how we feel about places, how places become emotionally meaningful, and how we might, feel a certain way because we're in a certain place. And so when I talk about emotional geographies with my students, I'm usually asking them to think about these questions like, how do we feel when we're in certain places? Like, how do you feel when you're in a church versus in your family's kitchen? Or how do you feel when you're at the beach versus in my classroom, for example? Very different feelings, right? Or how do you feel like if you're in an airport or if you're in a library, right? So how do these places kind of make you feel? But
Yeah.
also, how do we feel about places? So how do you feel about your home? Um, how do you feel about your town? How do you feel about your city or your nation? And those feelings can be everything from I feel really proud of my hometown to I feel really embarrassed of the place I'm from, right? So you can have these like range of emotions about places. And then there are particular places that we go sometimes because we want to feel a certain way. And so, where do you go when you want to feel comforted or loved? Or where do you go when you want to maybe let out some anger? Right. And so sometimes um, being in a particular place helps us tap into the emotions that we might want to feel. And all of this gets at the idea that emotions feel like they are interior. And I mean, this is often the psychological view on emotion, right? That they originate somewhere inside of us. Maybe it's in our viscera, maybe it's in our neurological wiring, but it's coming from somewhere inside of us. Sociologists come along and say, yeah, partly, but also those feelings are also coming from the outside in. And so emotional geographies is a way of thinking about that inside out, outside in formulation in connection with the places where we are.
It's a fascinating, as somebody, listeners may know that my expertise is emotions from a psychological perspective. And yes, we are very much like emotions is something that happens to organisms in environments. But I totally get your point. Organisms in environments. So the emotion happens at the nexus of these two things, right? It takes an environment and an emotion, and then who's to say exactly where the emotion originates at this point? It's the whole thing. It's a fascinating concept. Really, really, really is. So it would be. I would invite listeners perhaps to maybe pause and take a second to try to think about, because I was doing this as I was listening to you, try to answer some of your questions. Where do you
Yes.
go if you want to feel inspired? Where do you go if you want to feel, you know, maybe nostalgic or sad? Or where do you go when you want to feel this or feel that? Or to think about if there are any places that have an emotional pull on you. I think we could all, as humans, identify quite a few right away. So that's a fascinating description. Thank you for explaining it that way.
I liked when you said the how, right? Or how does this place make you feel? What do you
Yeah.
associate with that? Yeah, definitely. And
Very
you take the
interesting.
sense of emotional geography of world schooling further when you say that you see it as multi-scalar and mobile. Can you explain that a little bit further?
Sure, yeah. So when I'm talking about the emotional geography of world schooling as multi-scalar, I'm using this concept of scale, still from geography, from cultural geography in particular, to think about the geographies we inhabit are simultaneously very present and immediate, but also like unfathomably vast, right?
Yeah.
So the geographies that I inhabit I would probably say start like at the scale of the body and then scale out. So the body, the home, the neighborhood, the town, the city, the region or the state, the nation, right? The nation, especially when we start talking about citizenship, becomes like a key scale. And then the globe, again, a key scale for thinking about global citizenship. The solar system, the universe, right? It's that that kind of nested scaling, and we're in all, like, these are all happening at the same time, right? We kind of toggle back and forth between maybe being really aware of being in our bodies or being really aware of being in our neighborhood or something. So that's what I'm getting at with multiscalar. But I'm also using multiscalar to do the thing that sociologists do, which is to constantly look at the relationship between the individual and the collective. So sociologists are interested in understanding our personal experiences in context with public issues or with like broader social forces, broader social institutions. So what the individual is feeling can often be traced to something that is going on emotionally at a broader level.
Broader level.
And
Yeah.
so here, what I'm thinking about is, in particular in the paper, what I'm talking about is how one of the reasons that world schooling parents decide to shift their lifestyle and adopt world schooling in the first place is because they often feel a deep dissatisfaction with their current lives. So they feel like their lives are too hectic, too fast-paced, too overwhelming, too materialistic, that they're prioritizing or giving their time and energy to things that aren't really their priorities, right? They're working too much, spending too much time commuting, not spending enough time with their precious children. And so they develop this kind of deep dissatisfaction with sort of the status quo that they find themselves in. Now, does that dissatisfaction come from inside of that one individual person? Or does that sense of overwhelm and being overscheduled actually come from broader social patterns, that broader social arrangements, right? Where we're all kind of working too much and we're commuting too much and we're overextended in these different ways. And so, of course, it's both, right? It's both an internal feeling of overwhelm and dissatisfaction, but it's also kind of like a social atmosphere, right, that they find themselves in. And so that's how I'm kind of trying to think of the motivation to world school as multiscalar, right, as being both intimate, but at the intimate level, but also a public issue.
Right. Right.
And then in terms of the mobile geography of world schooling, so this is a little bit of a leap of faith, right? So I have to ask like my readers and listeners to kind of come along with me on this one. But what I'm trying to get at here is that world schooling families travel pretty constantly, right? Like maybe they're moving every few weeks or every few months. And so really travel is the key to how they're experiencing the world. So I couldn't really point to a particular place and say, oh, world schooling happens in Kansas,
Right.
or world schooling happens in Paris, or world schooling happens in Bali. It's more what really the geography I'm really trying to map out here is that world schooling is happening on the move from Kansas to Paris to Bali to Nepal. And so in that sense, it's mobile. It's more about like an itinerary or a juxtaposition of different places throughout the experience.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
It's the process of moving, right? And not any of the particular stops. Although a particular stop can be can lead to a particular project that the child is going to work on, let's say. But it's the process of moving that you refer to. Very interesting. You also mentioned that and I'm quoting you here, as families move from place to place, the mobile geographies of world schooling inspire what you call a repertoire of emotional competencies in children. And of course, listeners who are parents will recognize that a big part of having kids and socializing them is teaching them emotional competencies, right? Learning facts is wonderful, semantic knowledge is great, but our children need to develop emotional competencies. And you talk specifically, you have this great phrase, you talk about an emotional curriculum of global citizenship. derived through travel, as you just said. So I'm very interested in this. What should listeners understand by this idea of an emotional curriculum of global citizenship, and how do we get there?
Yeah. Well, I guess it might be helpful to kind of break that up a little bit and talk first about
Please
the
do.
emotional curriculum and then
Yeah.
how I'm thinking about it in terms of global
Mm-hmm.
citizenship.
Please do.
So this idea of the emotional curriculum, this kind of came to me because I would talk to parents who were similar to Carissa, who I write about at the beginning of the article. And for listeners who haven't read the article, I'll just say a quick bit about
Sure.
what Carissa was describing. So Carissa was world schooling her kids. They were traveling all over. They had been to Asia. I think they were in Africa when she was writing this uh, blog post or article about her experience. And she had been really trying to keep her kids on track, right? She had a curriculum for them. She had certain goals for reading, writing, history, culture, language, all this stuff. And she was like really excited by what her kids were experiencing. And she was trying to get her daughter to write an essay about it.
Mm.
They're in the courtyard at their guest house, and her daughter was refusing to write the essay. And Carissa was like beside herself, like, oh no, they're never going to learn anything if I don't stick to this curriculum. And in the end, mother and daughter both end up in tears, right?
Oh,
I'm sure a lot of parents can relate to this like the
okay.
homework struggle, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So Carissa was, distraught and didn't know what to do. So she turned for advice to other parents who were doing something similar. And the advice she got, and the advice most parents gave me as well, was don't try to impose school on the road. Let
Right.
travel be school, right? Let that be what your kids are learning. And so what Carissa eventually did, and what a majority of the parents I interviewed did, and what I did as well, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but I took my son out of school in the fifth grade. He was 10, and my husband and I traveled with him for 7 months and world schooled him while I was doing the ethnography for this project.
Right. Right. We hadn't told that to
And
listeners. Yeah, indeed.
yeah, and
Hmm.
Yeah, that
I
count. Yeah.
was, yeah, I was like Carissa. I had downloaded all the textbooks. I had gotten all the like fifth grade learning outcomes from the principal at his school. I was like, we're keeping him on track no matter what, right? I was determined.
Yeah.
But what I, along with all these other parents, quickly realized is that's really both not very feasible, but also kind of a waste of the experience,
Right.
right? And
Yeah.
so I count myself in this group, turned to an educational model called unschooling.
Unschooling.
I don't know if y'all are familiar with unschooling.
Never heard of it. No.
I can see Andrea is nodding
Yeah.
about it, but I can say a little bit about it if it would be
Oh,
helpful.
please do.
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Okay, so unschooling is an alternative schooling model. It was pioneered in the 1960s and 70s by an educator named John Holt. And one of his first books was called How Schools Fail Children. I hope I'm getting that title correct. I'll have to fact check myself.
We'll have to check
How Schools
that.
Fail Children. But basically his argument was that schools were like they were failing to tap into and inspire children's natural creative desire to learn. And instead, they were pigeonholing them into standardized curricula with predetermined learning outcomes and testing. And the curriculum that he was critiquing at the time, he thought was children were being asked to learn things that didn't really relate to their real worlds, to their real lives. And so not only were children not interested in what they were learning, they kind of lost interest in learning itself.
Learning itself. Right.
And so he saw this as a real tragedy in the educational system.
Yeah.
So the antidote he proposed was unschooling, which is this idea that children are born wanting to learn. They are just natural learners. And that rather than imposing onto them what they should be learning, we should be following their lead, and that they should follow their curiosity. They should look at what is intrinsically interesting to them, and they should spend time figuring that out. And so what unschooling might look like, this kind of like intuitive learning, asking questions about the world and then figuring out those questions, might look like, for example, you take the kids to the beach and they want to know, where are the waves coming from? And why are the waves so close in the morning and so far away in the afternoon? And because they're going to be naturally curious about the things that they're experiencing, they can then begin to figure that out and maybe become interested in studying the science of tides, for example, right?
Yeah.
So that's sort of the idea behind it. So the world schooling parents that I talked to in my research, they really see themselves as countercultural rebels, right? So they are already on board with alternative education models. A lot of them had sent their kids to Montessori schools or to Waldorf schools. I had sent my son to a Waldorf Steiner school for a while as well. So the leap to unschooling wasn't a huge one for them. Right. They were already kind of moving in that direction of looking for unconventional ways of educating their kids. So unschooling really fit philosophically with where they already were. These are people who really value freedom, autonomy, self-reliance, individualism, and unschooling is a highly individualized form of learning because each kid is moving at their own pace, following, right?
Yeah.
But bonus, it also fits really well with a traveling lifestyle because with unschooling, you don't have, you have to have an exam on Tuesday, or you've got like, a timetable where you have to do 3 hours of work every day. You don't have any of that. So when you have travel days where you're going to be at the airport all day, or you need a day to get over jet lag, it's like logistically it fits in with the world schooling lifestyle as well. So, all right. So this is a really long way to come back to this idea of the emotional curriculum. So imagine parents who have decided to unschool their kids, right? They're excited about it, but it's a little bit of a leap of faith, what's my kid actually going to learn? And so I noticed in the interviews I was doing and in the way they were describing unschooling, they were a little bit ambivalent. There were a little bit like mixed results. And so parents would say things like, well, my daughter missed learning all of the US presidents because she didn't go to second grade in America, but she learned how to play with kids who speak 5 different languages. But she learned how to make change in a different currency, right? And so what they would do is they would talk about what their kids did learn as a way of offsetting what they weren't learning, perhaps in terms of the academic canon. And so that turned into most of those life lessons that kids were learning struck me as emotional skills. Right? These are a lot of emotional skills, also some social developmental skills, but really it was about how their kids were learning how to feel. And so I started just collecting a list of all these different emotions. And I have a table in the paper where I outline them, but things like how to deal with change, how to be adaptable, how to be flexible, how to be empathetic, how to feel gratitude, how to be responsible, how to be resilient in the face of difficulty, self-confidence, self-awareness, global awareness, right? So you can sort of see how these became the learning outcomes.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean by emotional curriculum. Kids were learning how to be independent, how to handle risk in a healthy way, how to meet new friends, how to say goodbye to new friends. I think that's a big one for TCKs, right?
Yeah.
Right. So that's the emotional curriculum
Yeah.
that I'm talking about.
Interesting concept. Yeah. And I
Fascinating.
found the book that you mentioned by John Holt, and Holt is Holt, How Children Fail. for the listeners if they want to look at this book.
How
Thank
Children
you.
Fail?
How Children Fail.
Okay. Okay. Andrea, I think you have in
Yeah,
our
I have
little
the
list
next
there,
question.
in our little
Yeah.
list of, because this isn't improvised, folks. We wrote these.
We did
We're
our
not that
research
good.
on your research.
Uh,
Yeah, the next fascinating concept we found very interesting, and we would like you to explain a little bit to us and to our listeners, is the concept of effective citizenship,
right.
which
And to be,
sounds
yeah,
very unusual.
yeah.
And yeah, if
And
you would
and
please like to
Sure.
explain that.
and to be
Matthew,
clear,
yeah?
so listeners got that right. That's not effective, as in that's efficacy, but affective citizenship. Yeah, I make that
Yeah.
point because often when you say affect to students, they think they're not sure if they heard effect or
Oh,
something.
yeah, yes, with an
Right.
A.
So
Yes.
so affective citizenship. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Yes, affective citizenship, which is a concept I borrow from fabulous feminist theorists like Anne-Marie Fortier and Sarah Ahmed and Lauren Berlant. And here we're using the word affect, kind of in parallel with emotion, but if we could sort of make the distinction that emotion maybe is like the feelings that you can name, like love, hate, disgust, sadness, right? We can maybe call that emotion. Affect is a bit more amorphous, and it's not very easy to put your finger on it, but it's like it's like a feeling that's maybe like welling up in you, but you can't quite name it, or it's like a mood or an atmosphere. And so affective citizenship is getting at this idea that there's like an embodied sentiment around citizenship. So the distinction I'm making here is between, let's say, like legal or constitutional citizenship and affective citizenship. So, as a US citizen or a citizen of most nations, we have a certain, there's sort of like this set of rights and responsibilities that are codified in the legal system or in the Constitution. I have the right to vote or the responsibility to pay taxes, or I have certain rights under the court system, right? That's what I mean by like legal or constitutional citizenship.
Yeah.
Affective citizenship is more about, do I feel like I belong here? Like, do I feel like I belong in this nation? Do I feel like I don't belong? How do I feel about the nation? Am I proud? Like, do I have a sense of patriotism, or am I ashamed of my nation? Do I have feelings of camaraderie with my fellow citizens? Do I have feelings of welcome or exclusion toward outside others? Right. So it's moving more toward how our sense of being a citizen or belonging is really about how we feel, and maybe less about which passport we're holding.
Right.
And what was really fascinating to me in talking to Worldschooling parents and reading their blogs and their social media forum posts and stuff is that on one side, they are really navigating the legal codified side of citizenship. They're, applying for passports, they're applying for visas, they're figuring out how many days they've been out of the country to figure out how much tax they have to pay. They're kind of engaging in all of those bureaucratic regimes. They're getting their absentee ballot so they can vote from abroad, right? So in a lot of ways, they, as the adults, are really engaged in practicing their legal rights and responsibilities as citizens. But when it comes to thinking about their kids and their deeply held desire that their children becomes global citizens, their version of global citizenship almost never refers to anything legal or constitutional or codified, and is almost entirely defined in terms of emotions. So what should a good, young, budding global citizen feel like? Right?
Yeah.
What feelings should their kids be cultivating in order to be good global citizens. And so that's where the emotional curriculum intersects with global citizenship.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because parents are trying to help their children foster a certain set of emotions or sensibilities about themselves and their place in the world, and about the other people that they're encountering in the world. And so so to me, their version of global citizenship is affective citizenship, primarily. It's primarily about how the kids feel, or how the kids feel global. That's where that term comes from.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept because in the TCK kind of space, I think this concept can really be understood by some when you think about people who repatriate and then have this kind of almost kind of icky feeling about, well, this is my nation, I belong here, and yet I don't, and I cringe even at being a citizen of that nation on paper, for example. So that would fit into in this concept, in this situation here. We would say that there's certainly some negative or unpleasant elements of their effective citizenship towards their nation.
Absolutely. And we can also think of it on the flip side, right? Where their affective loyalties or their affective commitments might be to a country where they don't hold a passport.
What exactly? Yes, yes.
Definitely, yeah.
Oh, yes,
Especially for kids
fascinating.
during the developmental years, right? The country where they maybe spend most of their time in.
Right, right, right. So having explained all these wonderful concepts, let's get down to how you actually ran the study. So your objective was, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, was to explore this whole process, to explore the intersection of emotions, learning, mobility, and this development of global citizenship in children. And you did this by looking at people's accounts of world schooling, parents' accounts of world schooling, but I think you also kind of engaged in it yourself. So what, if we go really kind of broadly, what can you tell us about what all this meant in terms of what did you do to run this study, the methodology, in other words? How did you work? What did you end up having to do to gather all this information and write this wonderful paper in the end?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it was a lot. And I think like one of the key differences between maybe methodologies in psychology and in sociology or anthropology, which also very much informs my methodology, is that I couldn't just sort of run an experiment, right?
Right.
To kind of get at what I was
Impossible.
interested in. So so what I did is I developed this methodology when I was writing my first book on tourism and technology, and it's called MOVE, MOVE, and that stands for Mobile Virtual Ethnography. So at its heart, my methodological approach is ethnographic, right? I really wanted to immerse myself in a community of practice and really understand the practice from the perspective of the people who were doing it. But how do you immerse yourself in a community that is not in a place?
Right, that's constantly in the
Right.
move, on the
Mobile.
move.
That is very
Right.
mobile.
So that's where so that's where I had to get a little bit, I had to
Yeah,
make some
creative.
adaptations to the
Yeah.
ethnographic techniques. And so I did that in two ways. The first was, of course, a lot of these families are quite accessible, and that's online, right? So a lot of these families were publishing blogs, they were, publishing social media accounts, they were coalescing in discussion forums on social media platforms. And so I was able to find them there and interact with them there and collect data online. And I did that for about a year, a little over a year. I actually collected all of the content from 50 blogs that families had published, along with some other online content that was being put up. And then I also, as we discussed earlier, I decided to try this out myself. So I asked my son if he'd be willing to do this. And he said, sure, where are we going? And so I had a sabbatical year, and we took that year. We took Elliot out of school and we traveled for 7 months. We went to all 7 continents.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and along the way, I met up with and interviewed about a dozen families. And the families I was able to connect with, some of them I knew them online because I had met them through their blogs or on the social media forums. And we would realize, oh, we're going to be in Buenos Aires in January. We're going to be there too. And so we would get together, or I met up with a few families in Chiang Mai. We would get together for play dates that were actually research interviews.
It's a
Right.
nice way
So,
to combine, yeah, to combine
yeah,
activities,
exactly.
professional and familial.
Oh,
Right,
interesting.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's not coincidental. I mean, I really think that traveling with my family was the key to me having access to the people I wanted to
Yeah.
interact with,
Yeah,
right?
and that's
And
so interesting because we didn't see that in your research paper. We saw that, okay, yeah, you went for 7 months all over the
Yeah.
world,
yeah,
but I didn't
I write
realize that it was based upon your research.
right.
Mm.
I write about it a lot more in the book. The World is Our
Okay.
Classroom, the
Uh-huh.
extreme parenting and the rise of world schooling. I reflect on it a lot more there because I think sometimes as researchers, this is a bit of a tangent. I think sometimes as researchers, we kind of disavow our families,
Yeah,
right? We're
I would
kind of like,
agree.
oh,
Yeah.
I need to go into the field, but like, don't tell anyone I have a kid, right? Right? Because there's this sense, especially for women, I think that it somehow
Yeah.
is unprofessional or something. But
Yeah.
more and more, I'm absolutely convinced that there is, and I'm not the only one. A lot of people have been writing about this for a long time, that accompanied research, right, is actually a methodology, and accompanied meaning accompanied by your kids.
By a kid. And
Okay.
how old
Um,
was Elliot when you did this, your son?
he was 10.
10.
10.
10 years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
What an
Wow.
adventure.
Yeah.
Yes. And he was a great research assistant.
Oh
Wonderful.
And
my.
Good job, Elliot.
yes. So that was the mobile part, right? Where I was actually traveling, actually interacting with families on the move. And and of course it included this auto-ethnographic component as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Right. So yeah. So that's a lot of it. Well, it's one thing to actually move around, but to carry out this project and staying a mom at the same time, that's a big challenge.
Yeah.
Did you come home exhausted?
I
That was not a question on our
That's
list,
not. Yeah.
Mary.
uh,
That's. I know, but I can't help. I can't help
well,
it.
no, it's a really good question, and this is something that world schooling families
Right.
eh, deal with, right? Is really
Mm-hmm.
getting road weary.
Mm.
And I would say
Yeah.
in our 7th month of travel was when we first started to get homesick. Ironically, we had rented an Airbnb in Buenos Aires, and it was probably the homiest situation we had had. We had our own washer and
Oh.
dryer, we had our own kitchen, we had,
Mhm.
a really comfortable little apartment. We had access to great museums and restaurants and stuff. So it was probably the most comfortable situation we'd had. And yet that's where we started to get homesick.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
It evoked homesickness in you.
Yes.
hmm
Oh my.
Fascinating.
And so
Yeah.
I would
Fascinating.
say we were pretty ready to get
Yeah. And did you
Yeah.
cut the trip
home.
short or was it always planned to be 7 months?
It was always planned to be 7 months.
Oh, okay.
Oh, that's
Okay.
plan. Okay. Interesting.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Very interesting. And you know what? I checked the Facebook group because you wrote in your research 2014-15 that there was 6,000 people in the Facebook group World Schoolers. And nowadays it's almost 69,000.
Are you kidding?
So,
Wow.
yeah. So the
Wow.
concept sort of completely exploded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's been covered in the popular media a lot.
Uh-huh.
You'll find a lot of like lifestyle columns and
Yeah.
stuff, like the travel section
Yeah.
will often profile world schooling families. But the
Yeah.
academic research on it is still very
No.
sparse.
Well,
I
I'm
think
I'm not
it was,
surprised that something based on unschooling is a threat to to
oh
institutions
my
of
God,
education.
definitely.
That's why, yeah,
Yeah,
that's why we're still on the margins here. Yeah.
right. Definitely.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right, right.
So
Yeah.
our next question would refer to the conclusions of your research paper that you derive from the process. So you have many, and we sort of need to restrict ourselves to just part of them here in the podcast. The first one we're interested is what can you tell us who exactly you sort of found who are those world schoolers?
Yeah. Who are those weird folks who do this?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah, I probably should have mentioned this earlier as well, but so so there is a demographic pattern that I identified, but I really have to make the caveat that world schoolers are a very diverse population. Like I can sort of tell you some of the the patterns that I noticed, but be very just expect
Yeah.
to always find world schoolers who do not fit this pattern.
Gotcha.
But basically, the people I interviewed and the broader population of world schooling families that I engaged with tend to be middle class, well-educated professionalized from countries in the global north, right? Or what we might consider to
Yeah.
be westernized societies.
Yeah.
They tend to have ample financial resources. Not all, some families are really traveling on a shoestring budget, but they tend to have ample financial resources and or they have assets or skills that they can leverage for income to help fund their travels. And in fact, a lot of the parents in my original study and ones that I've been studying more recently, I'm doing research now on digital nomad families,
Yes.
were digital nomads. And so they were able to, this was even before COVID, right? So they were working remotely and they were able to do either launch online businesses or get freelance contracts that they could do remotely to fund their travels. And the when we look at the ages, the parents tended to be in their 30s and 40s on average.
Okay.
The children ranged in age from teenagers, getting ready to launch their own lives, all the way down to infants who were born while the family was traveling.
Wow.
So the whole gamut there.
Wow.
And there's actually sort of a niche conversation in the world schooling community about giving birth abroad. It's
World
actually
birthing would be the word.
right there. You go. Yeah,
Yeah,
that could be the
fantastic.
next project.
Wow.
And
Interesting.
most of I would say the children clustered around elementary and middle school age. That tended to be the age range that parents felt was like the most portable, right?
Yeah.
They weren't so attached to their friends that they couldn't leave. What they were learning was still on a par with what parents felt comfortable, sort of
Yeah.
guiding them in, until
Yeah.
your kid's like doing, differential equations and
Yeah,
you're
Yeah.
you're
physics
like
and
really out of your out of your league. And then there was definitely a phenomenon that one of the mothers in my study called teenage turmoil. So as kids became teenagers, they would often ask to stop traveling because
right.
they wanted to establish a more solid peer group. They wanted to differentiate from their parents. I think the psychological literature
Child development.
probably corroborates this as well, that
Yeah.
adolescent
Yeah.
developmental phase. I remember one of the mothers in the study said her son was a teenager and wanted to stop traveling. And she's like, I understand it because when you're a teenager, you need to leave home. And how do you leave home if you have no home?
If you have
Yeah.
no home.
And
Right.
and so
You already
right.
left.
So yeah.
Yes.
So right. So they also the family configurations were also quite different. So as a sociologist, I don't come into the study saying, oh, a family is two parents, two kids, right? I don't think of it like that. I look at how are people doing family, or how are people performing their familyness. And
Yeah.
then I look at, oh, what does that configuration look like? And so that was really quite varied. Of course, there were a lot of what we would call nuclear family configurations of heterosexual partnered parents with two or three kids, but there were also single parent headed families traveling. There were parents with, one kid. There were parents with 7 kids. There were parents, same-sex couple parents. The children, sometimes the children were adopted. There was a lot of racial diversity in some of the families. So the parents might be from different races, or the children might be from different races, mixed race families. Several of the families had children with special needs.
Oh, interesting.
So they
I
were
was
traveling with.
surprised by that. Yeah.
Mhm. And I, I don't I didn't correlate the numbers, but I was struck by how many families, one of the reasons they really liked unschooling is because their children had either been diagnosed with ADD or ADHD in the US system, educational system, or they were worried that their kids would be diagnosed if they
Right.
kept them in the institutional system.
Yeah.
And so for them, unschooling was a way of not pathologizing their kids' need to
Yeah.
move and be outside and be doing things all the time. It was a way
Yeah.
of like embracing that
Mm.
as a form of learning. And
Yeah.
so a lot of the families who are doing this were also navigating some of those different learning needs, or social needs, or physical needs for their kids. Um, Most of the families in my sample were white, but I think that the racial demographic is changing. I'm noticing that online, in the online and the media stuff I'm looking at. But also the racial demographic of homeschooling in the US is changing. A lot of Black families are adopting homeschooling. And I think they bring to the lifestyle and to the motivation sort of like a different layer of motivation for that, right? Of how schools are failing their kids.
Yes.
Um, it could be quite different to how maybe a white middle class parent thinks schools are
Yeah.
failing their
Yeah.
kids. So
Yeah.
that's been something interesting to watch.
Fascinating. Now, what
I hope that
about?
answers your question of who these folks are. They're
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Definitely, definitely. And the picture we get is that it's a growing kind of diverse pool of people,
Diversity.
but with still a trend towards Western societies, and perhaps a certain level of socioeconomic standing. Right. Um,
But that ties back to
yeah.
what you said before, right? It depends how world schooling is then identified. If you just, like you said, if it's just the weekend or just for a few weeks or a month, or
Right.
if you go completely
Right.
from the United States over to Asia, somebody has to pay the ticket, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, and what did you learn in terms of these world schoolers emotional curriculum, and I should say, I guess, curriculi, because there must be one curriculum. There must be as many curriculums as there are families in this context, and namely, what kind of and you kind of alluded a little bit to it before, but let's go back to the types of emotional competencies that the children develop as they evolved towards a feeling of global citizenship, or at least the type that the parents report. What can you tell us about that?
um, absolutely. So I would say you can maybe think about like an overarching emotional competency, which is that what parents really hoped their kids would develop was a sense of feeling at home in the world,
Okay.
right? So what they wanted was for their kids. So I kind of play around in other writings with the idea of the comfort zone, and that these world schooling families wanted to get their kids out of the comfort zone, out of their comfort zone, right? Out of their little suburban bubble where they just play video games all day and go to the mall or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But they wanted to get their kids out of that comfort zone. But what I realized was it wasn't about getting their kids out of their comfort zone. It was about expanding their comfort zone
Oh.
to the whole world.
Mm-hmm.
So they wanted their kids they wanted like, oh, you could drop my kid anywhere in the world and they would, be able to fend for themselves and they would be able to make friends and they would thrive. So that I would say is sort of like the overarching emotional competency is to be able to feel at home in the world.
Right.
And then if we break that down a little bit, I talked earlier about this idea of feeling global as how do you feel about yourself? How do you feel about your place in the world? And how do you feel about other people? So how do I feel about myself? The feeling global would be feeling confident, independent, self-reliant, self-aware. And because a lot of the unschooling model is so highly individualized, I think children also develop this sense of that like I matter and my voice matters, which we could potentially interpret as sort of like a form of entitlement, right?
Yeah.
Like I belong here. So that feeling, which is a nice, like it sounds nice, like a nice, secure feeling, right? And then that then kind of segues into how they feel about their place in the world, that they feel a sense of belonging, they feel maybe a sense of mastery, mastery over world, like how to travel, how to be with people who are different from you, how to try new things. And then in terms of the feelings that parents wanted to cultivate toward others, I would often see that parents wanted their children to feel a sense of responsibility in their global citizenship, right? That they not only do they belong, but that comes with a responsibility to also help out and give back. They wanted their children to feel a sense of respect, tolerance, empathy, compassion toward others. Some of the parents in the study were keen to expose their kids to situations of poverty, for example.
Right.
And in doing that, I think they were trying to elicit in their children a sense of maybe gratitude or appreciation for their own privilege.
Perhaps even perspective taking. Right.
Yeah, which gets a little tricky, right? Like as a sociologist, I'm a little, thinking, is this like slum tourism, right?
Yeah.
Is this problematic? But I can understand, what parents were trying to do with that.
Right. Right. But it could easily slip into the unethical.
Like a voyeurism.
Yes. Yeah. 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 So it's a
And,
thin ice to navigate. Yeah.
yeah. And all these findings were through interviews of the parents. You didn't interview children directly. I think, if I remember correctly, it was parents and participants over 18 years, right?
Right. So these were from the interviews and from the blog, the data I collected from their blogs as
Okay.
well,
Yeah.
where they were writing narratives. That's right. I did with my human subject approval guidelines. I only received approval to interview people 18 and over.
Right.
So I do think that there is, I think I learned a lot by doing what I did, but I
Yeah.
do think that children's voices are definitely missing from this
Yes.
interpretation. And I would
Yes.
love it if someone would be able to do a project that really centered children's experiences and children's voices.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
definitely. Or do like a
Because
follow-up study with that, with
yeah,
those
yeah.
families,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
But that's
Be-
like 10 years ago,
Because right, exactly. Yeah, they're probably all over 18 now.
right? Now you could ask them.
But I do think because there's like another dimension to this feeling global that I know was on the minds of parents that kids were not thinking about at all.
For
And that
sure.
is, will my kid get a job?
Mm.
Right? So what are the
Oh,
right?
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
what
yeah,
is sort
yeah.
of like the emotional toolkit that
Yeah.
will give my kid a leg up in
Yeah.
maybe like the global labor market?
Market.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
right, so employers are probably looking to hire employees who can work well in teams with different cultural perspectives, who can
Mm-hmm.
communicate across difference, who can like move into a project, get something done, and then, move out, and or
About,
maybe
yeah.
even move internationally. So I think parents were also thinking in terms of a skill set that would benefit their kids later, either to make them more employable or to make them more entrepreneurial.
Right.
Mm. Mm.
Right.
And you also mentioned that they're definitely gonna put that into the application essays for universities, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But I bet
Fascinating.
the kids weren't thinking about that.
No, they were just
Not at
thinking
all,
about
I'm
the.
sure
No.
not. But I found that an interesting comment. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you encountered anything unexpected findings or experiences during the process?
Well, I have to say, because it makes sense to me now, like now that I've done the research and done the
Uh-huh.
analysis, but at first I was really surprised by how many of these like middle class parents
Uh-huh.
were willing to do unschooling.
Mm,
And
mm,
I think it's because I was sort of coming from this world of helicopter parents,
mm.
right? Where it's
Yeah.
really about really keeping your kid on the straight and narrow and like making sure they're ticking all the boxes and exactly for so that they'll be, like prepared for their future to apply to college or whatever. And so when I first started interviewing these middle class parents, who were not helicopter parents, they were the opposite. That
Yeah.
really surprised me. That really kind
Mhm.
of laissez-faire
Uh-huh.
approach to learning and how they were trusting their kids so much, I thought was refreshing.
Mhm.
Although the deeper I got into talking to them and the analysis, I realized they were keeping their eye on the future too,
Right.
right?
Just in a different paradigm, using a different
Mhm.
paradigm.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
different strategies, different paradigm.
Yeah. Fascinating. Okay, so this is a fascinating topic, and we could listen to you for hours, and perhaps we'll have the chance to have you as a guest on another episode to discuss more of your research.
Yeah.
But as you know, this is the TCK Research Podcast, so uh, we've been talking about world schooling and emotional geographies, and it's not necessarily clear that world schoolers' children are, well, I guess they're kind of like third culture kids, but also not. So, uh, this concept of world schooling and emotional geographies is much broader in a sense than third culture kids. But what should TCKs, parents or caretakers of TCKs understand? What can they take away from your research in order to either understand or improve the TCK or the expat experience?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I agree, these categories are slippery, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like
very fuzzy.
I see so many overlaps, but at the same time, so many differences. But I think so I guess there are like, I don't know, and maybe you can also, because you two are so much more familiar with the TCK literature than I am. So like stop
Mhm.
me or correct me if I'm interpreting this wrong or something. But I kind of see like maybe 3 points of comparison.
Okay.
The first is the role of school. So it strikes me that for TCKs, and here I'm thinking maybe even more specifically, expat families who
Mhm.
are raising TCKs, school as an institution is a really important social anchor.
Mm,
It's a really important
Yeah.
like integrating mechanism in the new culture. So I
Agreed.
don't know if either of you went to international schools, but like the international school system is, I think, a really crucial part of how expat families enter into a new community
yeah.
and where kids often find belonging and parents too, I think,
Yep.
often find their like social network through the school. But I and of course that's very different from world schoolers. They
Yes.
are eschewing school, right? They are rejecting school
Yeah.
as an
Yeah.
institution. They're embracing learning, but
Yes.
they're not really reproducing the institution of school in that same way.
Yeah.
But I wonder what I would be curious to know from your listeners, or what I would maybe encourage your listeners to keep an eye out for. I wonder, with the rise in digital nomadism and the way digital nomads are kind of reshaping the arrangements of work, I wonder how that's going to also impact sort of like the expat labor market. And I also wonder if the expat community might begin to embrace homeschooling a bit more. I'm just curious if that's something that might happen, especially if digital nomadism becomes a more prominent factor in how work is organized in, 21st century.
Can we quickly describe for listeners what we mean by digital nomadism or digital nomads?
Sure. Yeah. So digital nomads are people, often tech professionals, but not always, but people who can work and earn a living online, remotely, and therefore are not tethered to an office. And so they can travel the world while doing their work. And they often take advantage of what's called geo arbitrage, which is where they will earn a like solid salary in hard currency in a westernized society economy, and then live in a low cost of living destination, perhaps in the global south, where that salary goes much further, and
Much
they can
further,
enjoy
yeah.
a much more amenity rich life, let's say.
Fascinating. Right,
Yeah.
right, right,
So
right.
those are digital nomads. And there's a lot of overlap between digital nomads and world schoolers. And I suspect we're going to see more overlap between digital nomads and expats.
Interesting.
Andrea, you are an expat and you've been for many years. Is that what does that make you? What does that make you think of? What would you hypothesize there?
I have no clue because one of the expat um, concepts is that you're sort of being sent by an entity, right? Might it be the military, missionary, the companies, international companies, and world schooling sounds more like you mentioned also with the digital nomad, self-initiated global experiences.
Right.
So I wonder how that's going to mix.
That was actually my second point.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. The motivation, yeah, what's the impetus to move?
Yeah, yeah.
Right,
Because
because
we
like
can
you're
always we can say, well, we were told to go to Thailand. It was sent over to Bali for 2 years, and then we had to leave because we had to move to Spain. But yeah, world schoolers are self-initiating all these processes.
Yeah. And I think that distinction leads to my third point. And this
Right.
is I think a real difference between maybe expats and TCKs and world schooling, which is that because the impetus to move for expats is for the parent's career, or they're being sent, a lot of times the family's mobility is like a byproduct of that, or like a trade-off of that. And so in those cases, mobility is seen as a problem that needs to be remedied, right?
Yes.
And that it might cause problems for the children that require some kind of therapeutic intervention, or some kind of, that it could be really problematic, that they
Certainly
could,
a source of complexity. Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Advantages
So
and challenges, right?
yeah.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. And from what I've read, it seems like the literature in that area focuses a lot more on the challenges.
Yes, I would say so.
But the
Yeah,
world schoolers have an almost opposite perspective.
correct.
They want their kids to move, right? So for world schoolers, it's a lifestyle project, like you were saying, Andrea, right? It's they're pursuing a lifestyle dream, and they see mobility as an opportunity, not as a challenge, right? And they see it as like a value proposition, that
Yeah.
their kids are going to gain all of these emotional competencies from doing it. And so rather than worrying about their kids or having them meet with a therapist or something, they're the opposite. They're like, no, this is great. This is fantastic for my kid.
Mm-hmm.
I
But
think, of course, I think we need to meet somewhere in the middle,
Agreed.
right? I think there's maybe a little bit too much pathologizing of the TCK experience and a little bit too much
mhm,
celebration of the world schooling experience.
yeah,
And it's probably something in the middle, right?
Yeah.
And it probably also depends a lot on each child and each family as
Yeah. Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but I think TCKs and world schoolers have a lot in common, right? In terms of the experiences they have,
mhm,
the way they negotiate a sense of belonging, the way they do friendship, the
Yeah.
way they're teaching all of us how to, establish and maintain friendships at a distance and through mobile communication
yep,
technologies. Um, and I think they're developing like similar sets of emotional competencies um, that that I think there's a lot to appreciate there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially the kind of outsider perspective that they're able to bring, which in a
mhm,
lot of ways is what we need in order to start imagining these better futures for
Futures.
ourselves,
Yeah.
is to
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
perspective that both of these experiences can evoke.
Mm-hmm.
mhm.
Well, what a wonderful way to end this discussion, I think. Right. On a positive note, and there's still so many questions, right, to understand about world
Right, yeah,
schooling. It's certainly tapped my interest.
mm,
Yeah, it's fascinating. It was wonderful to hear you, and thank you so much for explaining these things. That I know that when Andrea and I read the paper, we were worried as to whether we were even understanding these complex things
exactly,
that you're not used to. What do you mean emotional geographies? And that we would read the description. I kind of get it, but I'm not sure if I get it. And I think you did a fantastic job explaining this
yes,
for us and for
yeah.
listeners in a very down to earth way that can be understood by all. So thank you very much for that,
Yeah.
Jenny.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your questions and for this conversation. I've enjoyed it so much.
Fantastic,
No, it was really
fantastic.
nice to have you here and to dive deep, very deep into your research.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'll
Mm-hmm.
just say, if anyone's interested in learning more, can I
Yes,
just plug
plug
my
the
book
book.
really quickly?
Absolutely.
Yes,
Plug away.
please,
Yeah,
definitely,
I
definitely.
should have brought a copy of it, but it's called The World is Our Classroom:
Hmm.
Extreme Parenting and the Rise of World Schooling. And it's published by NYU Press.
NYU Press. So we will put that in the show notes.
Excellent.
And I believe you have other books also. We can put those in the show note as well. Yes, so if if listeners are interested in becoming readers,
There you go.
I knew I was going somewhere with that error. Please get the book and learn more about this fascinating concept. And I'm curious. You never know. You might have a listener somewhere who goes, I think I want to try this. I'm wondering if listeners want to get in touch with us and tell us whether they're intending to or if some have already tried it. We would love to hear from you.
Definitely, because I mean the concept of homeschooling has sort of been known for a while. I
Yeah.
remember back when we were in China, 2005, there was a family with 3 kids that did homeschooling. But I haven't heard from many digital nomads or expat families who are doing world schooling. So it would be
Yeah.
really interesting to hear from listeners who have
Yeah.
experienced this. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So Jenny, thank you again, and we really enjoyed it. Thank you for participating on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Likewise,
Bye.
thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the TCK Research Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Please subscribe, like, and share our podcast and leave us a review. It really helps others find us. If you have any questions or comments, please write to us at tckresearchpod@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, and we promise we'll answer all emails. We wish you a good day wherever you are, and we hope you'll join us again for the next episode.